Welcome to today's keynote. I'm your host, Chris Wofford.
And I'm Rick Geddes.
Fascinating keynote today, audience. The catastrophic wartime situation in Ukraine is, of course, ever evolving. But one day, this war will end, and policy experts and engineers around the world have been preparing for the inevitable rebuild. Among them, Cornell's Rick Geddes. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rick. Great to have you in the studio.
Great. Thanks, Christopher. Good to be here.
Yeah, this is going to be lovely. Viewers, I'm going to ask you to be involved for a minute here. We're going to put up a QR code for you to respond to a couple of poll questions as we kick today's discussion off. In addition, we'll also be taking your questions throughout the chat, so submit them at any time. I'll be getting them here on my iPad. So let's bring the audience into this one, Rick, and get a sense of where people are joining us from. So this is our first question. Where are you joining us from? Rick, while we wait for this to populate, it takes a second for the audience to chime in. You're the director of the Cornell program in infrastructure policy, and through that, you've been working quite a bit on Ukraine over the last 2 years. Tell us how people on the infrastructure policy and engineering side are thinking about Ukraine right now.
Yeah, great question, Christopher. Yeah. So I think it's useful to divide those groups into two people inside Ukraine and people outside of Ukraine.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians are very intent on renovating their infrastructure particularly in the West, and bringing it back to the standard that it was before the war. Mm-hmm. They're not waiting for some definitive end to the conflict before they begin to reconstruct their infrastructure. Mm-hmm. It's a point of national pride for them to bring back their communications, power, and transportation networks as soon as they can. Now, of course, it's difficult because the war is still going on. Outside of Ukraine, I think there's a large level of risk aversion from large, heavy civil construction companies, from international aid organizations, and so forth, about investing in Ukraine while there's still hostilities. Mm-hmm. So the Ukrainians are gung-ho to really reconstruct their infrastructure. I think outside of Ukraine, they're kind of taking a wait and see, although there is movement, particularly in Western Ukraine, to start rebuilding as soon as possible.
So how does Cornell's program in infrastructure policy, CPIP we call it,
right?
What kind of work do you do there, and how is it related to what we're talking about today?
Well, we like to think of ourselves as thought leaders on this. That just like the mission of Cornell, that means three things: peer-reviewed academic research on this topic of how to rebuild in a smart, green, resilient way. Teaching can be students, it can be public sector asset owners, which are localities in Ukraine, and then public engagement and outreach. So that could be media, that could be the industry, and so forth. But really, Christopher, we think of ourselves as a convener. We kind of bring different people together. We've had Zoom calls with 5 different universities within Ukraine. So far, mostly engineering professors who are going to be the leaders within Ukraine and thinking about how to rebuild, in the best way we can. So we've done a number of events. We did an event at American Enterprise Institute that was a panel discussion I was very proud of, where we had Bob Zoellick, former head of the World Bank, and Senator Portman, just stepped down from Ohio, Natalie Jaresko, who was finance minister in 2014, and Matthew Murray, who's an old State Department hand. And so we convened that group. I urge people to watch the video on the internet and just listen to this panel discussion. So that's some of the value that we can provide.
Perfect. And that'll augment our conversation really nicely. So I'll mention to the audience, we're going to be sharing that URL in addition to the CPIP URL, the link to the American Enterprise Institute, which you had mentioned. It's a bit of a deeper dive than what we're getting into. We're not going to solve all the issues here in this hour, but good to do that. Okay, we've got a few people chiming in. Looks like continental U.S. here, Rick, for the most part, or North America rather.
Right.
Yeah. So great. Let's launch number 2 and just ask for those viewers who are with us scanning the QR code, what industry or field do you work in? So Rick, back to those Zoom calls you've had with people in the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. What kind of conversations are you having at this point, right? I mean, there's no end in sight, but what are some of the things that are being discussed currently?
Yeah, it's fascinating, actually. One of the big things in infrastructure delivery is just project selection. So that is, you have a scarce amount of money. What are the most urgent needs that you have? And of course, we in the United States have a certain lens through which we're fixing potholes and so forth. And it was very instructive to hear the Ukrainian experts talk about this Bomb shelters were one thing that they asked us. Having bomb shelter, clearly a type of infrastructure, but not one that we often, at least haven't thought about since the 1950s in the United States.
Yeah.
How do you locate them? How do you engineer a bomb shelter? That was a big issue when Kyiv was first attacked. People have to have somewhere to go. Schools, kindergartens have actually been destroyed in numbers. I was given some data from these faculty in Ukraine, and it boggles your mind. There's a whole generation of Ukrainian children who are going to be at a deficit from learning because schools, and particularly for young children,
Sure.
have been destroyed, damaged disproportionately. The other thing that even before current phase of the war, as we know, Ukraine is an enormous agricultural, that's what we're hearing just in the past couple of days, agricultural producing nation. And that means irrigation. And their irrigation system in the agricultural areas was Soviet era. And so they started talking to us about renovating water infrastructure to better irrigate and better make use of the water in an agricultural setting, which was a really new type of thinking relative to what my CPIP program had focused on before.
Exactly. So we've got some more finance people than maybe engineering than we anticipated.
Okay.
So
fair enough.
We'll see how that goes. A couple other issues, and I don't know if we want to get too into this, but recent news. Speaking of infrastructure, granaries, some of the action that's happening in Odessa. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, that's a rapidly developing story as it relates to this.
And I don't claim to be an expert on the current events of the past 24, 48 hours, but I think most people following this know that the grain deal with Russia fell through. And that Ukraine is this enormous, I urge people not just to think about grain, but many other agricultural products. Enormous global quantities of these things come out of Ukraine. And so Odessa is a huge port city. They export through the Black Sea, down through the Bosphorus and out, that way. And so there was a deal, an agreement that Russia would allow these ships to export grain, which huge populations around the world depend on. And obviously that collapsed. But what we've seen in the past couple days is Russia actively targeting agricultural export facilities in Odessa, including grain elevators and grain storage areas and so forth, just destroying the agricultural products, but also the export facilities themselves, which of course terrifies shippers, who would normally export this stuff from Odessa. So this has become really broadening, I think, the impacts of the war almost globally at this point, Christopher.
Yet another infrastructure challenge.
Yeah, really quite different.
Rick, I'm going to bestow the command
Thank you.
unto you.
I'm honored.
All right, let's get into Rick's presentation. So we're going to get the bigger picture here.
Right.
Hang tight, audience. If you have any questions throughout, drop them in the chat, and I'll be getting them here. So, Rick, over to you.
Sure. So one, let's just maybe give a little overview. Just fix ideas about the situation with regard to Ukrainian infrastructure. I think the first thing that viewers should take away is just the scale and scope of the destruction. Now, there's a minister in Ukraine who stated that almost 30% of Ukraine's infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed in some ways. People following what has happened, I'm an amateur historian of 20th century European military history, so this was interesting to me from the beginning. But we've seen these photographs of really just horrific levels of damage from drones, from artillery, from other sources. So viewers should hopefully just think about the sheer scale of infrastructure destruction in Ukraine. Here's a couple of bridges that are obviously destroyed and would probably have to be demolished in order to restore them. One of the other things I think viewers should keep in mind is that infrastructure has been targeted in Ukraine. We're seeing that just with the ports in Odessa as an explicit sort of military strategy. And that with regard to energy, so trying to take out the grid, which is obviously exposed, take out distribution centers, generating facilities, transmission facilities. As this slide indicates, transportation facilities have been explicitly targeted. Communications have been another aspect of the attack. And now, of course, we're seeing maritime infrastructure with port facilities. So one thing to keep in mind is there's really no distinction, or at least in my mind, not much of a distinction between the battlefield and actually targeting heavy civil and social infrastructure, including schools. One thing maybe we can think about together is suppose we could pull a magic switch on the wall, which I think we would all push, and there would be an end to the war. And there would be whatever form it takes, a treaty, a truce, an armistice, whatever it is, but the hostilities would cease. My guess is that there will be a large amount of international aid flowing into Ukraine, that is infrastructure funding, the underlying money to help them rebuild this infrastructure. So I think Ukraine's trying to do it. In fact, they're taking donations from overseas Ukrainians and others who want to help, so they're trying to do it. But I think what will happen once there's some resolution of the conflict is that the funding will not be a problem. I think there'll be a lot of money coming in. I think the question that we might want to explore is how do you spend that money in the most smart, compelling way to avoid some of the things we saw in, say, reconstruction of Iraq, reconstruction of it in Afghanistan, where there were some issues with regard to the scale of spending. So maybe I'll continue there to set the stage a little bit.
Yeah, you bet.
With regard to Ukraine, and again, to fix ideas, it might just be useful to take a look at a map of Ukraine and stop and think about its strategic location. Let's focus on transportation for a second. Although Ukraine, much to their credit, has repaired their energy facilities, they were known as an exporter of power before the war. And somehow or another, they've restored their energy infrastructure so that they are again exporting power to these neighboring countries, which is pretty impressive. But let's focus on transportation. If you think about rail and you think of on goods and you think about passengers as well as trucks, you can kind of see that Ukraine sits in a very strategic location, sort of between east and west, between Russia, Poland, Romania, et cetera, as well as north and south. And of course, the Black Sea is an enormous port sea for them, so you can put goods on rail and truck and take them out, from Poland, say, through Ukraine. So Ukraine's transportation infrastructure is a really, really important aspect. One of the things I've focused on most recently are the road and transportation systems. So it might be people who have been to Europe might recognize these M highways as sort of the European equivalent of our interstate highways. And so these are large divided, limited access, high-speed roads through Ukraine. And so you can kind of get the sense that Ukraine's pre-war infrastructure, at least with regard to highways, which of course carry both passengers and freight, is pretty highly developed. And there were plans for more developed. Of course, this map just gives you a flavor for some of these high-speed, what they call M highways. But of course, there's tons of local streets, local roads. They were developing pretty well prior to that. So in any event, you can think about how to restore that. Let me say just a few interesting facts about their transportation network, how extensive it is, how important it is. Transportation network carried 2 billion passengers in pre-war. 2019, 620 billion tons of freight. Pretty highly developed freight rail system, 170,000 kilometers of public roads. They make these distinctions with regard to roads that we don't really have here in the United States, but are more European in their nature. There's a key ministry, Ministry of Infrastructure of Ukraine, who's actually interested in interacting with the CPIP. He's in the military now, the minister, as are many males, but he's interested in interacting with CPIP as we do our thought leadership discussion on how to maybe provide advice on the best way to proceed with procurement. But this Ministry of Infrastructure of Ukraine, the MIU, develops and implements government policy and regulations. So they're really, that's not only them, but the main ministry that's going to oversee the reconstruction, at least, of the transportation network. One thing I really want to get across to our listeners is that Ukraine, pre-war, was really trying hard to become more European. And
in what way?
Well, more Western. So to be very specific, they really wanted to join the European Union.
Sure.
27 member countries of the European Union. But what many Americans, unless you study this, don't realize is you don't just say, hey, we're going to join the European Union today.
We're ready. Yeah.
We're ready.
Yeah.
No. So there's a whole series of economic reforms that your country has to meet in order to be a member of the European Union. Mm-hmm. And, you have to get away from the state-owned enterprise. You have to have, regulations, low corruption, all these factors. Mm-hmm. But Ukraine, very interestingly, was moving. They were not ready to join the European Union in 2019, no. But they were moving in that direction. And they were very earnest, and they were very, just like we're seeing now, engaged in high tech in their movement. So to be specific, I could talk about one thing that we do research on is public-private partnerships. And the Europeans use public-private partnerships a lot more than we do, which is just a long-term contract between usually a group of firms and the public sector owner, whoever the entity is that owns the road. And the MIU, the Ukrainian ministry, was exploring how to do these PPPs under a series of pilot projects prior to the war. And they had approved some feasibility studies. Listeners should know the International Finance Corporation and the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, were working with them. I was recently learned by somebody who at the World Bank is actually the descendant of the Marshall Plan to some degree after the Second World War.
Okay.
The EBRD, which is on the screen now, was more after the Soviet Union collapsed and there were these Eastern European countries to help those Eastern European countries develop. So to some extent, having the EBRD in there, is sensible. There'll be USAID, I think, coming in as well. I have a second bullet here where I note there were no toll roads. So Ukraine did not have what we have on I-95 and so forth, our tolls. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the discussion. But there was work underway to move towards more user pays, toll roads with PPPs with the private sector. By the way, I should note some of these PPP contracts can be 25 or 30 years, where the private sector is contracted to take care of the road, operation, maintenance, for a pretty long time.
Like how long?
25, 30 years.
Decades.
Is not.
Okay.
The Australians are past masters at this, by the way. They do a lot of these private road management. Mm-hmm. So that you and I were discussing before the show about the American problem of deferred maintenance.
Yes.
So it doesn't eliminate it, but it reduces that problem because contractually the private partner has to maintain the road to a certain standard. And they have to operate it. So if there's a dead animal on the road, how many minutes or hours does it take you to remove the dead animal? If there's an accident, how quickly do you remove it? So those are why these PPP concessions, I think, are so important for us to think about in a post-war environment. The thing is, though, Christopher, I predict, economists like to predict, is that if we could throw that magic switch on the wall and end the war in Ukraine, that the Ukrainians would quickly go back to their movement to joining the European Union. I think I really believe, and all the indications are that they would, which is why I think it's so important to look at what they were doing in this space before the war broke out. So maybe we'll take a pause.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions here.
Sure.
I have one from a viewer. Americans like to grumble about infrastructure, right?
We do.
That's
potholes.
That's
right.
kind of a thing that we do,
right?
Because we have some of these legacy projects, frankly, that sometimes go on for decades. Like we talked about. A viewer asked, "Do you think following the war infrastructure projects in Ukraine will take longer to finish? It seems like the U.S. infrastructure projects are never ending." This person cites JFK Airport. I'm thinking about the Big Dig in Boston. Things that do indeed take decades. So when we're scaling these things, when we're thinking about implementing these projects, what kind of timelines are we dealing with? Well, when you've got a country whose infrastructure has been destroyed, 30% of it is gone, right? You'd think you'd be working and operating on quicker timelines. What are we dealing with? What are they dealing with?
So I think, and this is shown in certain cases, that the United States can actually deliver infrastructure projects pretty quickly when it has to. Yep. And as we know, there was sadly a tanker outside of Philly that jackknifed on an exit full of, I guess, gasoline and caused an enormous fire, which burned the overpass that it was on. And that section of I-95 is heavily utilized, but it was repaired pretty quickly. Something similar happened in the Bay Area a few years ago. Again, they used a public-private partnership arrangement where the private partner was not going to get paid unless they met certain timeline milestones. And so, they had the incentive to do it pretty quickly. The things that hold up the United States, I mean, it's not just one thing, and permitting is one issue where it takes a long time to get the permits for a big project. That's actually in Congress right now with NEPA reform, National Environmental Policy Act of 1970. Oh. So this is an old act.
Yeah.
Another is what some people call a vetocracy, where any group can litigate and kind of hold up a big project. Okay. And that's actually, we could get off on that tangent in litigation through NEPA, which would take us too far afield. And there's just several things I think that conspire to slow down these big projects in the United States. My view is that things would go pretty quickly in Ukraine because they would have the funding, because there's a profound national desire to reconstruct their infrastructure. And let's be clear, Christopher, not just to repair what it was pre-war. I'm old enough to remember what Soviet construction looks like and Soviet apartment buildings. It was not up to code before the war. So there's going to be not just a rebuilding to the pre-war standards. I think there's a real desire to leapfrog in Ukraine up to 21st century smart, green, and resilient in a new meaning of the word resilient, infrastructure. So I think there's a national will and a global will to rebuild Ukraine to a really super high standard of heavy civil and social infrastructure. And we could talk about exactly what that means, but I do not think the things that hold up civil infrastructure projects in the United States now will apply in a post-war Ukraine.
Good to know. One viewer asked something, and this kind of changed my thinking a little bit.
Right.
A viewer asks, how is the rebuilding of schools going so far? Which made me think, okay, that's one part of it, but
right.
There's a prioritization here, right? And so Ukraine probably has to think, well, we need some roads to win this war, or
right.
You know what I mean? Like, so are they kind of working to sustain operations in order to win a war? How does this? You know what I'm getting at here?
Yes,
like, how do you make the prioritization?
So, Christopher, my sense from these discussions and they're academics talking to academics for the most part. We haven't had any ministers on the call, but there's a real sense that the focus is on the war. Yeah. And it's kind of sad because, the children need kindergartens and schools, but it's bad, right, in the East. And so there's a real focus on the heavy civil infrastructure that they need. Communications are critical.
Right.
Starlink, right? The internet, as we see if you follow the battlefield, they really are innovating in that. Those sort of connections of communications, broadly defined, are crucial. Transportation is crucial, right? You have to get these supplies, the military supplies, in and out. Power. Right, you just have to. You worry about the basic things first. Clean drinking water. One of the things, if you study infrastructure, you learn about a waterborne disease pretty quickly, which we see with hurricanes and floods in the United States. Really nasty stuff. Wastewater treatment. Right. So taking care of all the basic needs first is, I think, what they're thinking about. When we call them and talk about this, I talk about this magic lever on the wall that I could pull. It's kind of getting ahead of where they're so grateful. Yeah. Let me say, super grateful that Cornell is undertaking this, that we want to be thought leaders and help with this. But on the other hand, there's a real focus that the war is close to them and it's not over yet, and that they have to be concerned about, let's just say, war-related infrastructure first.
I have one more question from a viewer who asks, will these public-private partnerships help rebuild Ukraine quicker? So, and that leads to a question of mine, which is, have they ever had anything that was kind of structured like this? Thinking about back to the communist era, right? So is this new stuff?
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm chuckling a little bit because I think of Soviet
Yeah.
governance and public-private partnerships
That's
as
right.
kind of being diametrically opposed. So it was
Yeah.
a Soviet model.
Yeah.
So for the younger people, what that meant was Kyiv, centralized control of infrastructure funds, and that was what they were used to. It was Moscow, in the Soviet era, and the money to the oblasts, which I think are like states and localities, came from Kyiv, came
Yes.
from the center.
Yeah.
Now, one thing we should keep in mind, again, I'll go back to pre-war, 2019, trying to join the European Union, the word was devolution, which is what we have in the United States.
Sure.
Control over infrastructure was devolved from Kyiv to more localities, right? Now, that's a huge cultural shift for Ukrainians, right? And we, of course, in the United States are used to the town of Ithaca, every town controlling its own local roads, its drinking water and so forth. We just have, in counties as well, we just sort of have this. But for them, it was new. So that was part of this, joining the European Union. What that means is that those folks, and this is another topic that came up with our university calls, have to learn. They are not used to PPPs, and they're not used to innovative delivery. There's a huge learning curve for those local asset owners, infrastructure asset owners in Ukraine, to climb as we get into this. But yes, it's a big change. If we want to address the other question, can PPPs help with delivery? Let me introduce a four-letter word, but not one of those four-letter words.
What is it?
RISK. It's risk.
Yep.
So one thing you learn in infrastructure delivery is everything is risky. Things can go wrong at any time. The geology of the site might be bad. It could be contaminated. The design could be bad. The concrete could be bad. There's all these risks. One risk is time and cost risk. If you delay the project, time really is money. So you place that risk on the private partner. You have these milestone payments where they only get paid or they have a penalty if they're delayed. And guess what? Things happen fast, right?
Yeah.
If that's why I'm an advocate, supporter of the basic PPP model that a lot of other countries around the world use. Is it perfect? No. Nothing is perfect in infrastructure, but it can speed up the rate at which these projects will be delivered in a post-war environment.
I want to learn more from your deck.
Okay.
If we can continue with that.
Sure.
Viewers, excellent questions, by the way. Keep them coming, and,
Okay.
we'll hit some of those as we get later into the presentation.
Let's do it. Okay. So I think our discussion has been, I'm going to say dire, but somewhat sad, particularly with the Odessa port facilities being devastated. But let's look at some of the positive things. So I think every dark cloud has a silver lining. And I think there's a silver lining in this very dark cloud of the war in Ukraine. And that is that renovating Ukrainian infrastructure presents enormous opportunities, like I said, to leapfrog their country, to be a model, right? I really believe this, a model for the rest of the world in terms of how to do infrastructure right. And that's green, low carbon, low methane. It's resilient. It's also, I'll just introduce a term called future-proof. Some of my friends call it future enable. But let me just say future-proof means protecting Ukraine, the Ukrainian citizens and people, against the risk that the latest technology is not adopted in a long-term contract. If you lock in a contract for 20, 25 years, you might be worried that you lock in old technology. A future-proof contract can actually put the risk of not adopting the technology on the private partner. So I just want to put that in there, because I think, let me say another thing about infrastructure that people may not realize unless they're in this world. There is a quiet technological revolution going on right now in infrastructure delivery. And that is everything you can imagine. New types of concrete that use less carbon, implanting sensors in concrete, green steel, where you use green power to produce the steel, new designs, which are more efficient, all of this data that can be produced. So you can build a bridge now that will have hundreds of sensors on it that are emitting sort of low power, but a lot of information. I've seen sensors implanted in concrete that about the size of your thumbnail that emit 12 different chemical properties inside the concrete if you put a reader over the road. So infrastructure facilities nowadays can be very high-tech relative to infrastructure that we were used to 20 or 30 years ago. The key is not the development of all these. There's a ton of startups, laboratories and so forth that are producing this proven patented technology. The problem is adoption. So what I'm suggesting is that this provides an opportunity for Ukraine to really be a leader globally in showing how these really cutting edge, green, resilient, smart infrastructure technologies can be adopted and how they will improve infrastructure performance right in the long run. So I want to have that on the table, that there is this technological revolution. We all think about the internet, social media, Twitter, right? But engineers and infrastructure people are quieter about it. But the technological revolution is definitely taking place in infrastructure.
That's encouraging.
So let's take a look at some of this. One of the terms I would like the listeners to have is a term called value capture. And value capture is a really important concept, I think, in Ukraine. So I define value capture people may know value capture because say you have a subway system that you're running and you're going to put in a new subway stop. Boston has actually done a lot of this. Gee whiz, the value of the real estate around the subway stop will go up after the subway stop is built. So what you can do with value capture is to capture some of that increased value of the real estate, perhaps through what's called a TIF, tax increment financing, to pay for the installation of the subway stop. Kind of brilliant. Countries around the world are doing this. I define it more broadly using innovative delivery and technology to release latent value in extant infrastructure. The idea is that you use the new technology to capture often some type of waste. And you do this to pay for you borrow against that value to pay for the installation of the infrastructure in the first place. Let me give a couple of examples. Basically anything that produces methane, okay?
Oh. Natural
gas, okay? Now methane, people may know carbon. We talk a lot about carbon. Methane is also a greenhouse gas.
It's number two.
It's number two.
Yeah.
It doesn't last as long as in the atmosphere, but I've heard worse in some sense. Now we have a ton of waste methane that is being produced. Landfills produce it. Chicken farms produce it. Cattle ranches, the cattle waste. And again, the technology is key. The technology has now gotten to the point where it's efficient to capture the methane. You use the methane to turn turbines, and they can create electricity, which you then sell to the grid to offset the loss.
Yeah.
So that's one example of value capture. I could give others. Maybe I'll scoot ahead just while we're talking about methane. I'll go back. But I do want to give an example because you and I are sitting so close to it right now.
Yeah.
Right? And this is one of my favorite projects. We're sitting here in Ithaca, New York. Our wastewater treatment plant, I think, was getting on a century old. And Johnson Controls, a big company, came in and talked to the mayor. And they agreed to this value capture deal where they would install this big white digester, which you can walk down and jog past with. It has a plunger in the top. It captures methane from solid waste at the plant. That is then piped into these things that look like giant refrigerators, which I've seen. They turn at about 100,000 RPMs. So very high power, high speed power created by what otherwise would be waste in the atmosphere. So this whole technology was installed at virtually no cost to the city because Johnson Controls was able to capture part of the lower electric bill that the city faced, or that the wastewater treatment plant faced. They get some of it for the city, but Johnson Controls could lever against that and install this technology. This is a win-win-win, win for the environment, win for the city. You know, and it's certainly a win for the users of the plant, for all of us. It's a 20-year performance contract. Anyway, my point is that Ukraine could take these proven technologies, go through, and as they rebuild their Soviet-era wastewater treatment plants, they should be installing methane digesters. and the technology of this is advancing rapidly. Chicken farms, wastewater treatment, cattle farms, landfills. It's amazing how many infrastructure facilities. Let me say that another one that we heard about, water, okay? So water irrigation, there's drinking water for communities, obviously, and people should, never underestimate the importance of clean drinking water. But because Ukraine is such an enormous agricultural producer, irrigation systems, when we first started talking to, these were Ukrainian groups in America, I have to give a shout out to the U.S.-Ukrainian Business Council in D.C., which is like their Chamber of Commerce, and they've been wonderful in talking to us and helping us with infrastructure problems in Ukraine. One of the first things they talked about was the Soviet-era irrigation systems in much of the breadbasket part of Ukraine, and where they really want to upgrade that. Tons of leaks, just poor designs. Everything from the Soviet era needs to be brought up to speed. So I think there's probably opportunities for creative funding and financing, value capture in water as well. I could go on about that. Here's an interesting innovation.
How does this work? I have questions. What's going on here?
That's where I draw. These are cow farts.
Yep.
So that's where I draw the line.
Okay. Yeah.
But it is true that cows produce a ton of methane. And normally it's the waste which is harvested. I know some industry people who are involved with my CPIP program that are investing in small scale chicken waste methane capture on the eastern shore of Maryland, my home state, which people know is a big chicken farm. And so you can do this at small scale. I don't know if it makes sense to actually attach this thing to a cow, but I thought it was an innovative approach.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know how many cattle farms there are in ranches in Ukraine, but any sort of farm animals like this.
Yeah.
This is just something I kind of tossed out here because value capture deals are sometimes held up in the U.S. Because sometimes localities are, concerned about private sector partners coming in and installing this technology. I think there's enough value created through these to share some of that value and interesting financing arrangements. San Diego Water is one case of this that created a fund where some of that value went into a fund to support the workers who might be displaced by this technologies. And I haven't worked out in my own mind, Christopher, exactly how this could be applied in Ukraine. But I think if we sit down creatively, right, and sharing the value from this so that people aren't afraid of it or are not concerned, but buy into it, literally buy into it because they capture some of the value themselves. I'm convinced that the value created by jumping to these new cutting-edge technologies is so large that there would be enough value to share. You could install the technology, operate it, maintain it, but also share some of that with other groups. Anyway, I just wanted to put that on the table here. Let me I don't know when we want to take questions, but I'll just keep going on.
Yeah, let's go with this one, and then we'll do one after this slide.
Yeah, did I have? Yeah, I do have a slide on this. I also want to introduce to the audience the thinking, a couple different terms. Okay, now one thing about a PPP, a public-private partnership, is bundling, the keyword bundling of project elements together. So one of the biggest projects in our state is the Tappan Zee Bridge. Huge replacement project. I forget how many, 6 billion, whatever the number was, was done as what's called a design build, DB. And that was where the project, it was the Thruway Authority, combined design of the bridge together with its construction, with the build. And it was a DB because there were synergies. If you're a designer and you're making a beautiful bridge, you want to be talking to the construction people because they'll tell you if they can build that and what the cost would be. So you might say, oh, look at this beautiful new tower that we can make. Well, you want to talk to the construction company to see how much is that going to add to the cost. So that's a DB. You have bundled design and construction together. PPPs take that to the next level, where you bundle DB, design and construction, with O&M, and you have what's called a DBOM, design, build, operate, maintain. And if you throw in an F for financing, you have the gold standard in my world, which is a DBFOM contract, where you have a consortium of companies that provide different services under the auspices of basically a special purpose vehicle that will do this. So I want to have project bundling on the table as a term for the group. But I want to introduce another term that is not in common use, but I want to have this as in their minds be distinct from project bundling. That's project batching, okay? Now, putting a batch of similar projects together. And this is where I think Ukraine could really benefit. The problem in a lot of cases for small asset owners, the projects are just too small for big international civil construction companies to be interested in even bidding on this. So how do you overcome that? How do you get scale in the economic term? Mm-hmm. Well, you take a bunch of similar projects together and you batch them into one large procurement. And so I think Ukraine, given the extent of the destruction of, say, schools, bridges, and we could go on, courthouses, hospitals, you bundle, I prefer the term batch, those together, and then you get scale. You get a big, perhaps multi-billion-dollar project that you bid out. A big private sector consortium comes in and does that real quick. Mm-hmm. But they would do them the same, right? You'd have a bunch of schools that would say pretty much the same, kindergartens, hospitals, right, and so forth. So I'll give you one of my favorite projects again, Pennsylvania's Rapid Bridge Replacement Project. Know some of the people who helped pull this off, and it was really great. 558. If you've driven through Pennsylvania, you know it has streams and rivers, little bridges going over them. They batched 558 structurally deficient bridges together into one big contract, almost $1 billion. It was a global attention getter. That's a big number. And so they got a number of bidders involved here. And so I think Ukraine could bundle these together either in biogas capture projects or any heavy civil construction projects.
So there's something to be learned from Pennsylvania on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I think so.
You know, you and I talked about recent examples, excuse me, large-scale rebuilds. You know, and there's explicit intention on not committing the same mistakes that were made post-Iraq. What kind of mistakes were made? What did we learn from those, and how are things being done intentionally different now?
Well, my executive director, Richard Coyle, and I had a chat with a guy who spearheaded the post-Iraq report to Congress, which was 800 pages long on what happened with infrastructure reconstruction in Iraq. There's, let's just say, some billions of dollars were spent. There's some cautionary lessons associated with that.
Were there competing international interests? I don't know. Was Russia involved? You know, I don't really know.
I think at least there were several problems, but at least part of the problem is that it was not like there was peace, completely in Iraq.
Sure.
Even though we were ready to help reconstruct their infrastructure, there were still warring groups.
Yeah.
Some of the construction companies were very worried about the safety of their workers. There were cost-plus contracts where when the money ran out, the construction on the road stopped, and so the road was never connected to the network, which is we need a network of roads to make this effective.
Yeah.
And so it's the United States, not just the United States, but any country that wants to contribute. One thing, Christopher, I think there'll be countries that didn't want to contribute military equipment for one reason or another to Ukraine, but they will, I predict, come in with aid money to help Ukraine rebuild its infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And all these countries should be looking at what happened in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Maybe there's some positive lessons we could learn from that. Brookings Institution has done some very good studies on cautionary tales from Iraq and things that we should avoid. And of course, I'm suggesting policies, that I think would help squeeze as much value as you can out of every dollar of aid money. Mm-hmm. And so that's, a key thing here. So these are just some suggestions for that.
Great. You can continue. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll continue. Let me know if the audience has questions about what I just said.
I'm going to check out a few here while you're going.
Okay, yeah. So I'll go to another one, which is maybe a pet, not really a pet policy of mine, but something I'm very passionate about, and I think it's really underappreciated in maybe outside of transportation policy wonk
All right.
circles.
Okay.
And so this relies, I have to give a shout out to my two co-authors, Peter Crampton and Axel Okenfels. I think they're both at the University of Cologne in Germany now, working away as they do. And we have a series of papers together, one which I'm proud of appeared in Nature, and it's exactly on this topic. So this topic is the use of current technology that is in your personal electronic device, in your cell phone, to allow the pricing of road use, okay? So price per lane mile of road use in real time for the entire road network. Okay, so this is taking basic economics, supply and demand, and pushing it to its limit in terms of pricing the use of the roads. So most people who drive are familiar with traffic congestion. They are familiar with backups, and they're familiar with uncertainty in travel time, and the frustrations and the anger and the wasted fuel and wasted time, particularly if you live in a large urban area, that's associated with traffic congestion. Now, to the microeconomist, every bit of that traffic congestion is due to a mispricing in a key input into your trip. And the key input is not your car, not your gasoline, it's the use of the road space. Mm-hmm. And so this work, I have to give another shout out to a Nobel Prize winner, William Vickery from Columbia University, won a Nobel Prize. He did a lot of great work. One of the things he did was on congestion pricing. So this work is really inspired by William Vickery, who argued for this for much of his career. But at the time Vickery was writing, he started writing on this, I think, in the 60s and 70s. The technology that you and I take for granted today, where our cell phones are communicating with cell towers to satellites, is just something we do every day without thinking about it. Vickery understood that traffic congestion, a whole host of problems associated with a transportation network, could be addressed if we could just get pricing of the road space correct. Famously, he actually put a reader in his driveway. So Vickery thought the reader would be under your car. He thought it would be a thing that spun around and metered your road use under the car, and sensors would be planted in the roadway. Because at his time, he couldn't foresee that it would be above the car in the sense that your cell phone's communicating with satellites and cell towers and so forth. So my point is, technology is no longer a barrier to the adoption of the good economist solution to this. The problem is political will. So what I'm urging Ukraine to do is be a leader in policy, and not just in technology, but in policy. So it doesn't get caught once we're in hopefully a better world where its economy comes back, its industry and commerce come back. Unless it does this, its highways will become congested, once again. And as people know, traffic congestion globally is an enormous problem. There's wasted diesel, wasted gasoline. Here's some data, $1 trillion a year and growing rapidly. It's global. It's a global problem. U.S. drivers, 42 hours per year. We know L.A. is bad. Germany is bad as well. In this paper, and I'm going to make a plug for Crampton, Geddes, and Okenfels here, Peter Crampton's website on transport has all the papers you can download.
Yeah.
We make two really strong claims, all right, in this. First of all, you can build new lanes. You can build new roads. Unless you price the road, they will become just as congested as they were before you built.
All right, I need some clarity. So
okay.
when you say pricing the road, what are we talking about?
We're talking about, so this is not pie in the sky.
Yeah.
The state of Oregon
Yeah.
is a leader in this right now. State of Washington, I think, is doing this as well. Uh-huh. So this is pricing your use of the road per lane mile, or per some unit of use, okay? Based on, in those states, distance.
Okay, so this is the cost to Oregon.
This is the cost to the driver.
To the driver.
So right now, maybe we should take a step back for the audience.
Okay.
How do we pay for the roads? Well, we have gas and diesel taxes.
Yes.
It's not on the pump. It's kind of hard to figure out, but every time you buy a gallon of gas,
Got it.
18.4 cents goes to the feds, depending on your state. It varies a lot by state. Some cents per gallon goes to the state. If you're a truck driver, 24.4 cents per gallon of diesel fuel. And again, that varies by state, but it's built into the price you pay at the pump. You don't see it, but it's in that final dollar number you pay. And then the feds reallocate that money out of the Federal Highway Trust Fund every 5 or 6 years. That's what happened a couple of years ago when the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed. There was other stuff in there besides roads. But Congress was basically reallocating money out of the Federal Highway Trust Fund like they regularly do, right? But you can see a problem here. We are trying to discourage the use of fossil fuels for a variety of climate and other reasons. At the same time, we're relying on the use of fossil fuels to pay for the road system.
Yeah.
It's not sustainable. So you've got well, I could tell stories about that, but you've got to move to some new funding mechanism. So these states, which I think are pretty forward-looking, like the state of Oregon, are trying to switch not a new tax, but get rid of their state's gas and diesel tax and move to a cents per mile tax. It's called a RUC, a road usage fee. Mm-hmm. Some people call it an MBUF, which is a mileage-based user fee.
Yeah.
And so we're saying, Peter, Axel, and I, are saying, take that concept, take it to the highest level, and let that price vary. It's 2 or 3 cents per mile now, I think, in the state of Oregon. Take that and let it vary so that it clears the market in real time. That is, if you want to use a road that's really scarce and expensive at this time of the day, fine, but it's going to be more pricey. So that encourages you to shift, either commute earlier, commute later, carpool, bike, take public transit, whatever, okay? In these series of papers, we claim that if the prices can change fast enough, and you don't have to use your own brain, you could use some app on your phone that would just route you in the cheapest way possible to work, responding to prices in real time, right?
Yeah.
So you may use Waze or some app like that.
Yeah.
It's just saying, okay, avoid this backup or whatever. But imagine if that app could have as an input current road prices telling you how to move through your commute to the office, right? In that way, you would optimize your route and you would conserve on road space. It would make you avoid the highest price roads at that time. So it's not like you have to sit there in the car doing these calculations.
That is so cool. I'm glad I asked for clarity on that.
I have to get supply and demand diagrams in here. They're my favorite. American heavy civil construction project is the New Jersey Turnpike.
Oh, no.
And so so here, we're running out of time. But suppose you commute to work on the New Jersey Turnpike, you're going into Manhattan, it's 4 a.m. Well, guess what? Demand is low, right? For anybody who's had supply and demand, the demand curve is low, so you probably don't have a backup. In an economic sense, the market for road space clears. There's no congestion. There's no, we would also say, excess demand for road space, right? Now, suppose that you sleep in a little longer and you go get on the road at 8 a.m. This graph probably understates it, but demand shifts way to the right. Everybody wants to get onto the Jersey Turnpike at 8 a.m. And the economists would say you have excess demand for the road space. You have traffic congestion. The problem is the price of the road space use cannot vary, okay? So given I could go on about this. I mean, maybe I will.
Well, let me ask you this.
I have to have a picture of William Vickery.
I wondered when we were going to see William Vickery.
There it is.
So, closing the loop, bringing us back to Ukraine.
Right.
So, these are opportunities. There's probably political will to change the road price.
And it's called the war.
Yeah.
And the war provides the opportunity for, there's horrors associated with it, but it provides opportunity for change. And what I'm urging are be cutting edge in new policy.
Yes. Great.
Right?
Yeah. That's fantastic.
So I'm urging, and the Ukrainians, I think we've seen, are pretty high tech.
Yeah.
So they could develop these apps that would actually price roads use in real time.
Let me ask you something. There's a question from a viewer here who asks, is there anything in particular you find interesting regarding some of the new tech and environmentally friendly or sustainable, rather, projects that'll be used to help Ukraine build. Is there anything that you see as either a quick win or something that would introduce a seismic change? Obviously, you're passionate about the price of driving costs and things along those lines. Where are the quickest win opportunities for Ukraine?
Yeah. How much time do we have left? Sorry,
2 minutes.
I'll go for the one. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I could. The one I was reading about yesterday is converting rubble. So concrete is the single most used material in humanity, right? It's concrete. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And using rubble, grinding it up, and creating an aggregate. That means grinding it up in a certain way and reusing it, recycling that concrete in a new structure. Here's the question, though, Christopher, that if you're an engineer, is the new structure that uses the concrete aggregate just as strong? Is the concrete have all the properties that we like about concrete as if you used concrete afresh? Mm-hmm. There was a study out of Syria, which has a lot of rubble, recently that confirmed yes. And you can use up to 50% of the aggregate from the old rubble in the new concrete, and you'll have basically the same engineering properties as the new concrete. And so Ukraine, again, could be a leader in taking some of these demolished buildings and rubble and so forth, maybe getting rid of some of those Soviet apartment buildings, but don't just put it in a landfill. Recycle that, and this will save carbon. Concrete production is enormously carbon intensive for reasons we could go into, but this would save an enormous amount of carbon emissions if you regrind that to a certain standard and use that as this aggregate in the new concrete. So that's just one, and these studies are showing, it does have these properties of concrete that we like. So I think the opportunities for that sort of recycling, they call that the circular economy now, and just thinking innovatively about all of that, reusing rebar, concrete, all these new additives. We can make the concrete more elastic. There's additives that you can make in the concrete. The thing that bothers concrete is expansion and contraction with the weather. That's what wears it out. But having some sort of elastic mixture in there makes it more durable and more flexible. So that's just another example of this technological revolution I'm talking about.
Rick, you just unintentionally plugged a circular construction keynote that we have going on in a couple of weeks. I think it's on the 17th of August. We're connecting with Felix Heisel out of Arts, Architecture, and Planning, and concrete is one of the big focal points of our conversation. There's interesting projects going on here in Ithaca currently as it relates to circular construction.
So I think Ukraine, again, my hope, wish for Ukraine is that it would be a canonical example of how you can use these new materials, new concretes, new methods, just thinking creatively about a circular economy, low carbon, low methane emissions, but also resilient at the same time. And the rest of the world, could learn from that.
I've learned a lot from you. Thanks for coming in today, Rick Geddes, for the conversation on Ukraine today. Lovely to have you in. A couple links we should share before our audience goes to help augment the learning we've done today. So the couple things real quick. The Cornell Infrastructure Policy, the CPIP URL, let's drop that in the chat, in addition to the American Enterprise Institute
thank you.
Conference and panel that you were a part of, which was terrific. So viewers, by the way, thank you for the questions. Really appreciate your involvement. As a note, this is being recorded. The recording will be available very shortly. So share this URL with friends or colleagues or anyone who very well may be interested in this. Rick Geddes, thank you so much. Viewers, thank you so much. Let's say goodbye to our audience. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Take care.